Okay, so let's jump into today's topic, mastering the interview. So there's a few things I'm going to do. One is highlight how an interview in many ways is sort of like a first date. Then I'm going to go over the 5 most common questions that are typically asked in an interview. So you can kind of be thinking of responses before you go in, and then end with a few questions that you can be ready to ask of those interviewing you. That is always the final question is, do you have any questions for us? It is a total faux pas to be like, nope, I'm good. You always want some questions. So I'll give you some of those as well. But let's start here. So how is an interview sort of like a first date? And so let's break this into the before the date, during the date, after the date. Before, you want to set up your profile well, right? So let's assume you're on a dating app. Now, in terms of a job interview, that would be your LinkedIn profile, but also your resume. And you want your resume to be tailored to the job you're interviewing for, because that resume will really be able to support you. The bullet points on the work experience and different items like that become key items that you'll be talking about in the interview. If you're asked a question, which we'll go over here soon, and you're not sure what to say, you can even look at your interview or your resume and see some of those bullet points and be like, oh yeah, I've got a story for this one, or maybe it's highlighting, tempting them to ask you a question that you already have a story for. So that resume is almost like a cheat sheet for things you want to talk about. Obviously, research them. Just like you wouldn't go on a first date without having read their profile, and I don't know, you'd probably Google them or something. I doubt you do a full background check, right, on a first date, but you want to know as much about the organization you're applying to as possible, because you want to show up and be able to ask intelligent questions about them, and it shows your interest. It shows you've done your homework. Obviously, appearance and timeliness. You wouldn't show up to a first date in flip-flops and t-shirts and shorts. So professional dress, appropriate to whatever industry or company you're going to, and being on time. Like you make sure you know how to get where you're going, consider traffic. If it's an online interview, digital preparation for timeliness is important. Like inevitably you click your Zoom and it needs to like install a new driver right when the interview's starting. So whatever kind of interview you're doing, digital or live, it is so much better to get there early, even if you sit in the parking lot for a couple of minutes, than to go in. It's already stressful. You don't want to go in extra stressed because you're running behind. During the interview, body language, sitting up straight, making eye contact, smiling to a degree, not, don't overdo it, but generally showing enthusiasm. And I know for those of you, like a third of the population on personality scales has some degree of introversion. And so this can be extra kind of daunting. But these first impressions are so important. One study found that almost 90% of hiring managers already had an opinion of if they wanted to hire someone within the first few minutes of an interview. So it's not just the content of what you say and what's on your resume. It's sort of that just affability, that enthusiasm, that sort of general sense of like, oh, this is someone we'd like to have in our office or that we'd like to work with. So then you want to pay individualized attention to the role, the team, the company, and the industry, and in that order. So those are getting from more specific to broader. You wouldn't go on a first date and they want to know why you're interested in them, and you're like, "Wow, I'm just looking for a girlfriend." Right? Any girl will do. Like that doesn't make someone feel special. And in this way, you also want the organization to feel like they're, for whatever reason, the specific job you want. You want that role on that team at that company, not just any job anywhere. Now, maybe you do just want any job anywhere, within maybe a broad set of requirements, but you go into every interview trying to make them feel like this is the custom position for you. You were made for this and it was made for you. And that helps you go a long way to stand apart from many of the other applicants. And also don't bash the past. If you had a bad experience at a previous employer and that's why you're leaving, you don't want to badmouth the company you're leaving, because then they think, uh-oh, this is how they'll talk about us someday when they're doing something else, right? Just like if you're on a first date and they're just spending a bunch of time bashing their ex, that gives you a red flag, right? And so you want to speak positively of your previous employer, but focus the attention on where you're trying to get into. And then afterwards, always send a thank you email. If you go on a first date and you want a second one, you send some kind of communication, just thanking them for their time. It doesn't have to be long or intense. Jump on ChatGPT, type in the type of company you were at, say, hey, write me a quick email to thank them, edit it slightly and paste it in and send it, within, I would say, a few hours of the interview, at least within 24 hours. But it is just over and over again. If you're watching YouTube videos on interviewing or getting advice on this, that is probably one of the most common mistakes people make, is not thanking somebody after the interview. And it just can easily slip someone's mind, but it's actually way more important than you think. Okay, so before I get into the top 5 questions you're most likely to experience, I want to set up an idea to help you kind of think through preparing for interview questions. In the professionalization tactics module, I've put content there that can help you prepare for lots and lots and lots of questions, because you never know for sure what they're going to ask. And some questions are different to different industries. So there's no way you can prepare for every possibility. But one way you can kind of be thinking through, after you've developed some confidence in some of the basic questions, to think through like what else might be asked. Often you can think of this in Dyads. So I just put some here. This is not exhaustive, but they'll be asking a question, whether it's worded exactly like this or not. They'll be asking questions like, why should we be interested in you? But they'll also be asking, why are you interested in us? They'll ask, what are your strengths? And they may ask, what are your weaknesses? What challenges are in your past? What accomplishments are in your past? How well do you work alone? How well do you work in a team? What motivates you at work? What discourages you at work? How do you handle successes? How do you handle failures? What's your immediate value to the team? And long-term, what do you want to learn here? Or how do you want to grow? So when you land on a question you're preparing for, it can often be helpful to think like, what's the inverse of this question? Because there's a decent chance that you could get that version of that question as well. Okay, so that's a tip to have in your mind as you're preparing. Now let's get into the top 5 questions. I would be shocked if you go to an interview and you don't get asked at least one, if not multiple of these 5. So question 1, this is usually the opener, and it's super broad and vague. And they're like, oh, so tell me about yourself. And the biggest mistake here is to give some long, like rambling story about your personal life, right? I was born on a stormy night back in 1990 or whenever. You want to keep it professional, stick to your education, key experiences, and skills relevant to the job. They're not asking about your whole life. They're asking about what is most relevant to the reason that you're there. Be concise. So you definitely rehearse this one. It should be like a minute. It's open-ended, but to them, it's like, tell me, quickly why you want to be here. That's basically what they're saying. And end with a goal. Link your background to why you're a good fit for the job. And you'll see that some of these questions, that same tip kind of pops back up, is that you're always linking your skills and experiences with the needs and job description of that role. So you need to be both aware of your own skills and experiences and have them kind of top of mind, at least the ones most relevant to this position, as well as what this role is asking for, what that company is looking for. Number 2, most commonly asked question, why are you interested in this position? So again, you want to show that enthusiasm. This is especially important for this question because you want to seem excited for that role. And even if you're not, it's entry level and you just want to put a year in and then move to something else, you still need to act like you're super pumped to be a part of this opportunity. Then you want to relate it to your career goals. How does the position align with your professional ambitions? But also, and I put in parentheses there, align with your professional ambitions that are good for them. If you eventually are like, well, I want to go start my own company, or I want to go, like, then they're thinking you already have a foot out the door. So you're aligning how they are not just some stepping stone, but how they're sort of really putting you on a pathway towards where you want to be, which could potentially be with them long term, right? So be careful not to say things like, well, I want to be, your boss type thing. You don't want to come off overly cocky or in a hurry. You don't want to come off like somebody who's looking to leave after a short period of time. Keep in mind, they're taking a risk if they hire you to train you and spend money on you. And if you don't stay long enough, they don't get their return on that investment. So you want in this interview them to feel like they're a good place for you to be, but and you'll potentially be there for a while, whether that's true or not. And then highlight your skills. You're interested in this position because it matches these specific skill sets you have. And those skills will help contribute to the company's success. Number 3 most common question. Can you describe a challenge or conflict you faced at work and how you dealt with it? And sometimes you'll get a question like, what are your weaknesses, strengths and weaknesses? But in every interview, there will be some question about overcoming conflict, your weaknesses, something about the negativity and how you deal with it. So if it's phrased like this, it's a great chance to tell a story. So make sure you have a story or two in mind that you can tell it within a minute. And just like any storytelling, like you're watching a show on TV, you got to set the scene, give a little bit of context, right? Then focus on the action. What were the specific things that you did? So what went wrong? There's got to be some plot arc. What went wrong? What did you do? And then what positive outcome was on the other end? It's just classic narrative arc, right? Context, problem, solutions, happy ending, and try to just encapsulate, have a couple of those stories in mind that you can tell pretty quickly. All right, number 4 most asked question. Describe a project or accomplishment that you consider very significant in your career. So in a way, this is the inverse of the last one. The last one's like a challenge that you had to overcome. This one's an accomplishment. Now, one thing is that a lot of these answers could be the same, right? Overcoming a challenge is itself an accomplishment. So when you prepare some of these stories, keep in mind that they can potentially be used for multiple questions. So it's helpful to have just a few stories in mind and know the skills you want to link to that job, and then be ready to pull from some of those prepared scripts in your mind for different wordings of these questions. So, but if you get asked this one, select relevant projects. So especially if you don't have a long work history, there might not be as much for you to want to pull from. That's where the idea of the resume bank that I've talked about in the past is super helpful. It's sort of this exhaustive list of things you've done. So that way, when you're preparing for an interview, you can go through and be like, which of these random things might connect to this specific job? And you can kind of be pulling relevant projects, relevant tasks, stories. So then detail your role, explain the specific contributions. You always want to kind of give these concrete answers and not super vague. Well, I was just enthusiastic and have a real go-get-em attitude, and so I won them over, right? Like it's too vague, it's cliche. You need concrete things, right? Like, well, I had to lead this, X project. It took this many months. We did it under budget. We had this, this many people showed up and bought the product or whatever it was. But and quantifiable is super helpful. If you go back to the resume module, I talk about writing high impact bullet points for your work experience. And one of those main tips is that you want to make at least a couple of those bullet points quantifiable outcomes, some statistic like percentage change, some number of people who bought or participated or that you mentored or tutored or whatever it was. Using numbers just makes your answers sound super concrete. It is definitely an industry best practice in writing resumes and interviewing, because keep in mind, in some ways, your interview is almost like an oral resume. And lastly, 5th most common question, why should we hire you? This is very often like second to last question they'll ask you. The very last is usually, do you have any questions for us? Which I'll get to in a second, but they'll almost always ask something like, why you? Why should we hire you? And so one, match, again, and I've said this before, but match your skills with the job requirements. Directly tie your strengths to the job's needs. It's not just that you can do the job, it's that you're particularly skilled for this job, right? So you might have a list of soft skills and hard skills, but you're only going to lift the ones most relevant to this job to put on the resume that you send in, and then you're only going to use those items to talk about in this interview. Unless you get asked some curveball and you come up with something, it's okay to think on your feet. But definitely, if they're looking for somebody who's detail oriented, that's not a good time to talk about how creative and artistic you are, right? If it's something that's creative and artistic, then you might not want to talk about how you can do Python computer coding. So you want to match the skills to their needs, show you're a team fit, demonstrate your personal qualities and how that aligns with company culture. You might be on a sales team. You might be working remotely alone. You might be indoors or outdoors or working with patients or kids. So this sort of team fit component is really important, because while you may have some versatility, the job probably has a more narrow sort of frame of kind of the team you'll be with, or the team you will not be with. And so you want to make it, you want to be aware of what that role looks like, so that way you talk about yourself in a way that matches it. And if there's not enough information in the job description for you to know this, then that's when it could be helpful to jump on the LinkedIn alumni tool, see if you can't talk to somebody in that company. It's probably you'll be able to find someone, at least if it's a decent sized company, and ask questions about the role. Okay, and then offer unique qualities. So what sets you apart from other people? Have just an idea, right? If you're just like, well, I'm motivated, I'm enthusiastic, I have a college degree. Okay, well, that's you and every other applicant. So what's a thing or two that gives you a kind of competitive advantage? And you should be able to think of something. Especially if you put the work in on building a resume bank, then it's a lot easier when you're preparing customized resumes and preparing for specific tailored interviews. Okay, and then they'll finally ask, do you have any questions for us? And so I put 5 questions that you could ask them. I also recommend using ChatGPT for preparing for questions to both answer and ask. Literally take the job description, put it in ChatGPT, take the About Us page of their website, put it in ChatGPT, and say, you're interviewing me from this company for this job. And if you want, you could even put your resume, paste your resume in, and then say, give me answers I can tell to, first, give me a bunch of questions that you might ask. Then, what are some answers using my resume? It's a good practice tool, especially if you don't have time to talk to other people who work there or something like that. Anyway, top 5 questions to ask them. 1, what's a typical day look like in this position? What can I be? What should I expect that the day will look like? Because they tend to have a feeling for like what they want someone to do. It's either a new position no one's done, and they might be a little more vague, but they have some kind of, it means somebody was excited to create it. And so you want to get a sense of what, key thing or two they're most excited about. The 80-20 rule, like 80% of, donors usually make up, or 80% of donors usually make up only 20% of funding for like a nonprofit, and vice versa. That can be applied to a lot of things. Similarly, it's like 20% of the tasks in a job are what your employer is like 80% excited for you to be doing. So you want to figure out what those are, and then speak to that. Like, oh, that's great. That link back to one of those skills to mention how you're really excited that that's what they want you to be doing. 2, how do you measure success for this role? That kind of lets you know, like, like, how do you know if you're doing a good job? It's not just punching the clock, right? And sometimes there's a mismatch between what they're hoping for and what they're measuring, but just getting some clarity, like what does a good outcome look like, and get their opinion on that. And then this is a question that kind of makes you look like a team player. You're looking to help solve problems. Is ask, what are the biggest challenges facing the team right now? It also gives you some insight into what you're jumping into, right? Because once you land in that position, if they hire you, that's going to be kind of the reality you're facing. So it's actually really helpful to know, and it makes you look like somebody who is already trying to like think about the problems you can solve. Number 4, tell me about the company's trajectory. And that could either be broken into 2 questions. You could ask just one of them, especially if you've already covered some of these details in the discussion that's led up to it. But trajectory is, how has the company changed over the last few years? You could ask that. But also trajectory is, hey, what are the company's plans for development or growth in the next few years? And so you can either ask it kind of vague and as a both and, or you can focus in on the trajectory up till now or the trajectory into the near future. In either way, if you ask about the past, it shows you want some context of the role. You're thinking specifically about it. And if you're asking about the future, it kind of makes you look forward thinking. So both of them are beneficial. And then lastly, how can I deliver the most how can I deliver the most value to the team within the first 90 days of this role? I like this question because it shows that you want to be of value and you want to hit the ground running. And so, there may be a very specific project they want you to be helping with as a deadline. You don't know, but it lets you know, especially if they kind of reveal that they really need something done soon. That's something that you can like really try to emphasize. Oh, that's perfect. I'm a match for that because, and then again, pull from those skills or stories or what have you to try to say that you're a great person for this. Now, you can ask questions throughout the interview at appropriate pauses. If some interviews are structured, and so they're reading off a script and you can't really ask a question back until the very end when they ask you. But others are more informal, and you can make it more conversational, and you can ask a question here and there in the middle of them asking you questions. If you're allowed to do that, then asking some of these questions early lets you know for later in the interview, like, okay, really make sure I mention things that connect to like what their biggest, what they're telling me will help me add the most value. And you can kind of cycle back and have that prepared. It's just like in a first date. I don't know if you've thought of questions you want to ask the person before going into it, but I've been on dates that were, I'm talking to this person and they're not telling me a thing, and they're not asking me a thing, right? And that is either of those can be challenging. So it's supposed to be a kind of a two-way street. You are not just there to get grilled. In some ways, you're interviewing them. And I know when you're really desperate for a job, it doesn't feel like you're an equal participant. It feels like they have the power. But try to go into this picturing yourself as someone who has lots of interviews lined up, and you're going to have more than one option. And so you're deciding who to pick. It's not just them deciding if they're going to pick you. You're also interviewing them, right? And don't come off cocky, but you also don't want to come off desperate. And I think even just thinking that way before you go in will give you some confidence to not be afraid to really ask them some questions, right? Okay, so those are the tips. In summary, it was think in some ways of the interview as a first date and some of the natural things you do in preparing for that. Realize that as you're brainstorming questions to have answers for, you can also often think of them as dyads, or opposites. And then I went through the top 5 most common, and then have at least 5 questions, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions that you want to ask them.